The F-150's developed a power steering fluid leak. Looks like it's down on fluid. Most likely culprit is the pressure hose going from the pump to the rack, the steering gear. I'm going to get the air intake tube out of the way. 10mm bolt. Pull it out of the fender and then just lift up in the middle. Push right out. I've decided to replace all 4 hoses. There's one from the reservoir to the pump. So if you look through the bumper opening underneath the radiator, you can see the hose that goes from the pump to the steering gear, and then right below it in front of the cross member is the line that comes and acts as a cooler. It comes from the steering gear, goes back up and connects to a hose right here that goes back up to the reservoir. And then lastly, from the cooler to the reservoir. Two 10mm nuts to take the guard off under the oil filter. 2 bolts on the cooler tube, 8mm head size. Save the bolts, came with new brackets, but need to reuse the M6 bolts. I have some M6 stainless steel ARP bolts. This would probably be a good application down under here to use them on. This is a look at my lines. You can see right there that the pressure line looks pretty ate up with rust. Looks pretty bigger diameter than it should be. Pretty meaty looking, just from bubbling up with rust. Look how wet they are. They've got a pretty good leak now, but I'm replacing all the lines. I'm surprised they didn't leak earlier. This thing didn't use any power steering fluid whatsoever, not since I've owned it. But it's time. Well, the first of those cooler bolts came out pretty hard, but certainly doesn't look too bad. Too bad. The power steering pump to the gear line, the pressure line, 8mm. A little extension is helpful. I'm going to loosen it, but I'm not going to take it all the way out. I think that the pressure line is pretty deteriorated. Probably will break off. So I'm going to leave it attached for now. I'm going to take the reservoir line off at the pump so I can drain the rest of the fluid out of the reservoir. So I can do it in a controlled manner into a cup. Just going to use a channel lock to squeeze that clamp. The serpentine belt's got to come off. I'm going to replace the pump anyway. Use my 1/2-inch drive long ratchet on the idler pulley, or the tensioner pulley. Take off the cooler return hose. Again, channel locks. I can take off the 3 8mm mounting bolts on the reservoir. Two on the back, and then one on the left side. The reservoir out. Give me a little better access to the 10mm head size pump bolts. This is a 10mm on the rack that holds both the pressure hose and the return line, both the inlet to the rack and then the outlet from the rack. It looks like it's being held on by one bolt. I'm accessing it from the driver's side, the left side wheel well. I've got the steering turned all the way to the left, so the rack is all the way to the left, so I can get in there between the frame and the cross member and the rack. This is what the plate looks like on the pressure line. So it goes up and grabs the return line, the line that goes to the cooler. And there we go, just about got the bolt out. Pressure lines on top that are returned or to the coolers on the bottom. Well, at least that bolt looks pretty clean. That bolt I just hit with a wire brush and then a little lacquer thinner. And this is what a scrap piece of pegboard comes in handy for. And spray paint that silver. So take a look at the bolt after I heated it in the oven. So it's got engine paint on it, silver engine paint that's been heated at 250 degrees for about a half an hour. See how the paint has shrunk down. You can clearly read the letters. I should have applied a couple more coats of paint. See how it's kind of weak on the edges, but it's for a quick job. I'm going to clean up the reservoir with a little bit of brake cleaner. See the screen down in there's got a little bit of debris in it. Here's the reservoir cleaned up. The screen looks pretty good in there. These were the two rusty ends of the pressure hose on the left hand side, and then the outlet of the steering gear to the cooler on the right hand side. These two are the rustiest. They're down under the engine oil filter where they don't get cleaned, so they get salt on them, and that's the ones that were leaking. So I gave them a good heavy coat of engine paint. Hopefully it'll help preserve them a little bit more. This is what the 3 mounting bolts for the pump look like. 10mm head size. Now this one is corroded at the end. It came out hard all the way. I was worried that it was stripping out the block, but it was because it was corroded on this end, because it was an open hole for the front one. That's this one. The back one was clean, and then the bottom one was in the back. It has these threads on it. It had a wiring harness mount on it for the wiring harness that goes to the sensor. This is what they look like coming from the sandblast cabinet. That's what they should look like getting ready for paint if you're going to use engine paint on them. They're to SSPC 10, or like a white metal. That's a really good finish for applying paint to. To remove the power steering pump pulley from the power steering pump, use a power steering pump pulley puller. It's almost impossible to do without this kit. So for the Ford, you need this tool. You could use this little plunger, but it's better to use the threaded adapter. You need the little bearing, and then you need the little C clamp to pull off the pulley. Chuck the power steering pump into your vise. Use a little PB blaster in the interface point between the pulley and the shaft. Use motor oil or a little PB blaster on the threads of your adapter so that it goes in easily and comes out easily. You'll regret it if you don't. It wears this adapter out and the little adapter can break off in your shaft. So thread it into the threaded hole. Notice the nut is smaller than the shaft, so it'll allow the pulley to come out over the square hex head. Thread the bearing and the tool onto the adapter. Position the C clamp over the threaded bearing. Notice there's a small side and a large side. The large side is the pulley side. Slip it on over the groove in the pulley and the bearing. Then just tighten the tool using a wrench to hold it on this nut and tighten it with the threads, and it'll just pull your pulley off of the shaft. Once I got the pulley off, I sandblasted it to white metal, sprayed it with black engine paint, cooked it in the oven. Then while it was still hot, I quickly brought it out to the garage and installed it on the new pump. I think it's going to be easiest to install this high pressure line on the pump off the truck. It swivels here. It's 18 millimeter and it swivels, so the alignment isn't important at this time, so install it off the truck. I decided to reuse the original fasteners. I sandblasted them, painted them, and then cooked them in the oven. So here's an update on my line removal from my steering gear. They're extremely difficult to get at. When they're in the truck, they look like this. There's a bolt that holds this bracket on. So simply an O-ring, they should just pull right out. Once you've got that bracket off and the bolt off, they should just pull right out. This one came out pretty difficult, and this one is still stuck in the truck, so I'm still working it with PB Blaster, and I'm using a plumber's torch with MAP gas that my neighbor has. Still working on it. I'll show you in the truck. So here's the gear side of the pressure line. You can see how the bracket came off hard. It's supposed to be flat. And so here's what's, there's 6 inches left of the pressure line that's still in the truck. So that's it in the truck. So you can see the bolt hole on the right hand side right here. That's the pressure line that I'm working on. There's the bolt hole, and then the other line goes underneath it. It's already out. So right there. So what I do is wrap the lower radiator hose here with aluminum foil, and then I have a steel plate that I put in there to protect it from the heat while I'm heating it up. And then on the bellows of the steering gear. So here's a shot from the wheel well with the tire turned all the way to the left, the steering wheel turned all the way to the left. See it there? It's tough to get to. I didn't have to do it on the other one. The other one came out easy compared to this. But what I did was I ran a jeweler's screwdriver in that groove. See that hose is countersunk. I ran a jeweler's screwdriver around that groove. That line is countersunk, so I ran a jeweler's screwdriver. This screwdriver sticking in the groove right now. Ran that around the groove, and I continued to use PB Blaster. Cleaned quite a bit of junk out of there. This is what the line to the cooler looked like. It's clean on the inside, and the O-ring still looks good even after heating it, and it's clean on this inside edge right here, but it was dirty here. It was dirty on this ridge, and that's what was keeping it in place. So this is the area that's countersunk into the steering gear. So I've cleaned that out on the other one, but the pressure line must be dirty down into here because it's extremely hard to get out. So here's what my setup looks like for protecting the radiator hose. I use a steel plate. This is just an old steel plate, aluminum foil around the hose, and then I set the plate right along the steering gearbox. And then I put another one on the rubber bellows of the steering gear. My next door neighbor is a plumber, so he let me borrow his torch with his MAP gas. It's supposed to be hotter than regular propane, and this torch is sure nice. It's nicer than the cheap propane torch. So let me fire it up for you. This tube sure does a lot better mixing the air and the fuel, and it has a pretty nice hot tip. With that, I'm getting in there and heating up that fitting. My lines were so rusty right here. This one actually broke. I cut this one to help get this line out, but this line was the offending pressure line that was leaking, and this line was extremely leaky. But my truck didn't use a drop of power steering fluid up until last week when this line started to leak. So I used heat and PB Blaster on these to get these out. I work for about half a day to get these out, and I let this one soak overnight. This one came out easy. You can see how it's just corroded here on this collar right here. This inside lip and the rest of it aren't corroded at all. But take a look at the pressure line. Look how corroded it is. This is the pressure connection. This is the upper one. It was corroded all the way into the O-ring. So I had to heat it several times and pull on it different ways. I used vice grips here to turn on it. I pushed on it, tried to knock it out. I eventually, after heating it probably 6 or 7 times, I cleaned out the groove, the countersink that this collar sits in. I cleaned that out with a jeweler's screwdriver, and I continued to work it with heat and PB Blaster, and then let it sit overnight. And eventually I got it to turn using vice grips on this collar right here. I got it to wiggle a little bit, and then finally got it to turn and eventually got it to come out. But you can see here all my tubes are extremely rusty. This one doesn't have a lot of life left in it. That's actually the cooler tube. You can see how rusty it is. And my pressure sensor is so rusty you'd never get that out. So I need to replace that. And even my pump is extremely rusty. Not that that would rust through or anything, but look how rusty the line is going to it. Even on this end, on the top end, wasn't near as bad, but look at the rust. Look at the rust flaking off of it. That's a winter truck that gets driven in the salt and sits in the summertime while I drive a car. To end on a positive note, this is the line that goes from the reservoir to the pump. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. It could probably go another 200,000 miles. So my F-150 now has about 201,000 on it. And it has everything new on the power steering system except for the rack and pinion. So here's what I think is an issue with the truck. It has this shield that aids during engine oil changes, and the rack and pinion goes right through here, so it protects the rack from getting engine oil on it. When you pull the filter sits right above here, and it sits above these two, above the rack and pinion. It sits above these two tubes, so it sits like this, and these two tubes then don't get washed, so they can collect moisture and salt underneath them. And when you go through a car wash or you wash the truck, these don't get washed, so I think it leads to corrosion on these two tubes because of this shield. The alternative is leaving it off and then getting engine oil on the rack, which isn't a practical solution either. It would be messy and it'll drip oil for days after an oil change. So this shield does help during the oil change. New pressure switch. I'm going to bench install it on the pressure hose. It's 14 millimeter. Yeah, I'm going to protect it with a little bit of masking tape. Hey, take note, when installing the new pump, the pump has these spacers on them, or positioning index pieces on both of the backside holes. The bolts are long enough that you can get them started, but then make sure you push the pump up tight to the engine block, and then hand tighten the bolts all the way the rest of the way. Install the hoses just like they came off the truck. With the plow bracket on my truck, being a plow truck, the cooler goes on only one way. It has to go from the left side of the truck to the right side of the truck. So that's it. I just got the F-150 back together, checking for leaks. Just purged the air out by turning the steering wheel from full lock left to full lock right several times, and then topped off the power steering fluid. Used Motorcraft 5. I used Motorcraft 5. It's the same stuff that I use in the transmission. That's what the book says to use for the transmission. But that works good in the power steering fluid too. It makes it quiet power steering fluid. Continuing to run the truck and check for leaks. fitting underneath. It's not leaking. Looking up at the oil filter. Goes back on that third bolt, the bottom right of the power steering pump, to hold the harness that goes to the pressure switch. That concludes the video. If you found it helpful, let me know in the comments, and if you did, please subscribe.